Good evening, everyone. This is Elaine Cercado. I'm your trainer, consultant, executive coach, and director of Power in You Philippines. I welcome you to this webinar, The Blended Workforce Revolution, a call for a new human capital manifesto. Our speaker is Mr. Jeremy Blaine. Jeremy Blaine is a chief executive of Performance Works International, or PWI. It is a company that helps organizations, executive boards, leaders, and teams succeed in the digital climate amidst disruption, opportunity, and uncertainty. Jeremy commands extensive experience as a transformation leader and advisor at the board level globally. He has operated on an international basis to launch successful businesses and to turn underperformance into excellence. Jeremy helps leaders and managers define strategies to implement digital and human transformations, utilizing a unique, co-created, and award-winning ticking clock model. And he'll tell you more about that shortly. On the back of this, he and his team engage leadership and management to develop fit for purpose plans that drive culture change at the operational level, to embed the required skills for successful modernization. Jeremy is proven at all stages of the business life cycle, from startup to internationalization, raising profiles and profits throughout. Jeremy has also been recognized by his industry peers and customers and named Global Game Changer of the Year for 2019 in the ACQ5 Global Awards. An executive board member of a multinational corporation shares this about Jeremy. Jeremy's focus has always been to cascade global best practice at local level and vice versa. He's a kind of driven manager that everyone values for his ability to commit to delivering results. At the same time, he's humble and keen to learn from each other. I'd strongly refer Jeremy to anyone involved in a digital and human transformation of their organization, business, and people. And I can attest to this. I've had a pleasure and honor of working with Jeremy and collaborating with him for a long, long time. And so everyone, let's all welcome Mr. Jeremy Blaine.
Thank you very much, Elaine, and thank you all for joining me at this time. I know it is into your evening here, and I also know that we're not in normalized remote working times. We are in a difficult situation. Perhaps some of us have got kids at home, we have other distractions, and therefore doing it at this time as well adds another level to that, I think. So thank you very much, and thank you to Power in You, and of course to my old friend Elaine. I recently moved back from leading another business from Singapore for 7 years, from 2011 to the end of 2018. And we had the opportunity to work very well together and continue to do so. And this really is at the heart of a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today. Barriers and borders are coming down globally, and we're able to cross borders very, very easily with the use of technologies like this. But we are also in unusual times. And when we set up this webinar, firstly, I was going to be talking about a revolution which was happening now. I'm now going to talk about this revolution accelerating through what is happening now as well. And it is about the rise of the blended workforce. And before I go into most of that, what I will do is just kind of clarify for you what we'll talk about today. First of all, I just want to put it in the context of what we're all going through in terms of the change. And in fact, where we were just 10 weeks ago, before the current pandemic has really taken over the economies of the world, has closed down our nations, etc. Then I'm going to take you through just the headlines of this research. And I'm happy to say that, first of all, you will get a copy of these slides at the end of it, but also you will receive a copy of the white paper with much more of the detail in it. So today, I just wanted to give you the flavor of the research itself, which was conducted and authored by myself and my partner in this research, Dr. Rochelle Haynes, who you can see here. And together, we are the gig HR experts. This is a terminology that we've created behind this research to indicate the need for organizations to think differently in terms of human capital management. So when I talk about the blended workforce, I just wanted to start by clarifying some definitions so that you can see what we're talking about. The blended workforce essentially is made up of our permanent workers, our permanent part-time workers, remote workers, contractors, stakeholders externally, it could be partners, but also the rise of the independent workforce that we're talking about, the gig economy as we've known it as, often called the alternative, the invisible workforce, the giggers, the mixers, a number of things. From our point of view is that there are a couple of dimensions at play in terms of how we work within this new workforce. First of all, we work in digital native ways where we embrace technologies and we work collaboratively that way. However, there is another parallel track where a number of us are still working very traditionally. So if you look across there, you'll see what I'm talking about. The blend is all of that coming together, and that is where we are. So the key question really is, well, the key question I was asking 10 weeks ago was, are you ready for the 2020s? Transformation acceleration. And I meant it behind this research and some research I did last year that Elaine talked about, which was the around the state of digital transformation. However, now with COVID-19, we're seeing an accelerator in play. Organizations are being forced into digitalizing, to adopting digital just to keep doing business and to work from home. But also, it is challenging how we are using our workforces and different workforces and where they're working from, as we all know on this call. But as we entered the 2020s, we were also going to welcome a brand new generation into the workplace. And this is where the traditional and the digital were clashing. And I'm going to start by just opening up a short poll. So what you will see on your screen, you'll see a poll come up, and I would like you to click the answer that you think. It's a true or false answer. 53% of Generation Z expect to have an AI personal assistant when they join the workforce in the 2020s. That is to help them do their job, figure out data, find the tasks that they need to do, and communicate with others. I'm going to launch the poll. Okay, let me end the polling, and I'm going to share the results. So on the screen, you should now see the results. So 77% of you saying that that is true, 23% saying it's false. I'm afraid to say it's false, ladies and gentlemen, and it's false because the number is higher, not lower. It is in fact over 63% of Gen Z that expect to have AI. So those of you with kids may know the way that teenagers right now and those leaving school or leaving university, their relationship with technology, they're doing a couple of things differently. They're using voice a lot more to interact, but they're also using their AI assistant. And even though that AI assistant is not so intelligent as we would like to think it is right now, it will become so. And it will become so very rapidly once we see some new technologies come in place, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So it's an interesting one. So that coming in as it is, the need for digitalization has been there as we entered the 2020s. And that was the preoccupation for many organizations, but there is a very strong human component as well. So the two things really are clashing together right now, as we see, and we can see it totally right now within COVID-19. We see on one side, we see the digital. We see a number of things happening. So the advent of 5G is just around the corner. In some countries, it has been launched. In other countries, it is just on the back burner for now. However, 5G is one of those technologies which is referred to as an unleashing technology. 5G, for example, is 10 times faster than your 4G that we have on our phones now, and equivalent or slightly faster than your fiber broadband that you might have at home. So just imagine what you can do with the power in your pocket when you have that there. 5G technology is the unleashing technology behind what Gen Z wants, the AIs in our pocket. 5G will be able to take that further. It will be able to do things like power much better autonomous vehicles, for example. And then as we move from 5G to quantum computing, away from traditional computing, where technology will be boundaryless in some ways, that will be where smart cities come in, and where we can do things within embedded ecosystems. It will unleash the Internet of Things, or so-called Internet of Things. And all these things around you are things that need to be in place now to prepare for that. One of the biggest issues that many organizations are not getting to is how to use data to make decisions and be more data driven and visualize data better for them and for their customers, but also how to manage customer data and cyber risk. Cyber risk by the end of 2021 will cost organizations an estimated $6 trillion. $6 trillion. That would put cyber risk debt or crime in one of the top 10 economies of the world, to put that in perspective for you. But if you look at the digital side, and there's many more on those sides, of course, but then wrap it to something that we don't talk about enough. This is more inherent. We know that this is side, but many organizations have been preoccupied with the digital first. The human side is changing just as rapidly, and it's catching a few organizations out. We talked about the rise of the independent workforce, and I'll obviously talk about that a little bit more. The rise of the blend that is there. We have also the clash between the digital natives and the traditional workers and how we work together. We're also having much greater debate, which is being accelerated again in COVID-19, around mental health and wellness in the workplace, particularly as we're moving into remote work so rapidly now. And let's remember, this is not normalized remote work yet. This is really quite interesting circumstances and very difficult for some. They need a lot of help. They need a lot of help at organizational level, new rules of the road, but also individual level too. The blended workforce will drive some inclusion and diversity messages, which we're also not getting to largely in some countries, which I'll come to later on. But when you put the two things together, the other piece which is in there is really key. If you consider that cyber risk piece that I talked about, then competitive advantage will become employee and competitive trust and customer trust. So once we have robust systems, we're on top of our technologies, we're talking to our employees and customers, we're protecting them and giving them the tools to do business and work together, collaborate and communicate, we're ahead of the game. When you wrap those two things together, what you find in the middle is actually the need for a mindset shift at organizational level. It is culture 4.0, as I like to call it, the fourth industrial revolution, a culture that is suitable for the digital era. And this is where we were 10 weeks ago. We have been thrust into this over the last 10 weeks, which is kind of interesting because it is already driving new ways of working. We're having companies that are no longer doing business, unfortunately, more being forced into the independent workforce. We've got different measures of success. So much is going on here that we have to have in mind. And for me, because this was a trend that I was so much on top of to start with, it's been incredible to see the acceleration of some of these trends over the last 10 weeks, because it's forced people to move forward. Just as an example of where we are now, 10 weeks ago, 44% of companies across the world did not allow remote work. They didn't even allow it. Now, over 80% of them are working remotely and being forced into it. It is challenging leadership and management, and that is where often there is a bit of a blocker within this, because what they're trying to do is replicate what happened in the office, but remotely, and it just won't work that way. Although this is not a remote working session, but that is one of the key issues, is where it can break down. So the rules of the road at organizational level and the individuals. As we go into more into the human factor as well, we see a lot more about the gig economy. This is how it's defined, as you see there. We're plenty used to this. I work in the gig economy. My whole business, if you look at my website, my whole business is global. it's regional, it's local, it is fueled 100% by a contingent workforce and partners. I'm absolutely embracing the blended way of working, blended workforce, and I'm reliant on technologies to do so. Interestingly enough, there are almost 60 million people, just if I take the US piece of data alone, that are now employed as independent workers. More and more companies are using this model. And I'll also tell you by 2025 shortly what the predicted number of independent workers in all of our companies globally is going to be. But if you look at that right now, that's an absolutely incredible number. And this is being fueled by technologies such as these underneath, which help organizations source. It helps you source work from experts. It helps us project manage with remote people. And by 2026, that number looks like it would double from the numbers from Small Biz Genius, who did this research. But I anticipate that now to accelerate a little bit more moving forward. But the gig economy is huge. So 60 million people already in the US. So, driving that changing face of the workforce within that, there has to be work that has to be done by many organizations. Because when you consider what I've just said there, with the fact that we have this workforce in there that need to represent all of these things as well. Our available human capital is so much more now than how we used to perceive it, which is permanent workers. One of the problems is that we often see independent workers right now as just an ad hoc thing. It's just somebody that we need in for specific expertise in IT or design or marketing, let's say here, but not as a fundamental part of our workforce. But it is becoming so. And when we consider that workforce, some are going to be online, offline. Most are going to be remote. We're going to blend not only those independent workers, but with more remote and part-time and flexible permanent workers as well. And I honestly don't believe we have an HR framework to cope with that right now. We have a traditional way of doing things. And then you think about 5G coming in, and you think about the unleashing technology. If we start to then see more intelligent AI and more robotics in the kind of organizations that we have, then we've also got that to cope with as well. And then it's the way that we work, because at the moment we have tended to be quite synchronous in the way that we work, i.e. in traditional organizational way. We do things at a certain time in a certain way based on the processes in our organization, often with dependencies of people or certain other projects finishing first or budgets or so on. And that is on demand, and that demand work, we then allocate resources to that, or we bring in independent workers. Right now, that is formalizing into an ecosystem of crowd working. So we're looking at what tasks we need to do. We're looking at it asynchronously, not necessarily in order or in line. And we're saying for this task here, we can create a team out of our permanent workers, our independent workers, other enabling platforms or apps over here. And we can do things differently. We can source whatever we need externally rather than our normal channels, and we can work collaboratively and remotely. And there are lots of enabling technologies already to do that right now. Google is a really good example of an organization that does this as a great model of an organization that actually is made up of more independent workers than it is of permanent workers. Temps, vendors, and contractors, as they talk about them, but they have created structures and rules of the road to actually manage this workforce as part of their own workforce. So the treatment of them is very different to actually many organizations that just bring in ad hoc resource step by step when they need it. So a poll for you. I talked about the gig economy in the US being 60 million individuals already. So I'm going to launch a poll for you now, and I'd like you to guess how much the gig economy in the US contributed in 2019, and these numbers are just out. So I'm going to launch a poll for you. The horse race is on. We have 1 trillion to 750 billion, but 762 coming out in front. I do sound like a commentator now as well. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now, and I'm going to share those results. So over 40% of you saying over 1 trillion, and then close second and third really, around the 750, 760 billion mark, with 54% of you feeling it's there. Those of you that said it was over 1 trillion are absolutely correct. It is a staggering amount in terms of the contribution of the independent workforce to the economy. And it just goes to show that the old mindsets of, you know, these workers aren't really bought into my business. They're not really contributing. They're doing ad hoc work. When you look at numbers like that, you realize the importance, strength, and power of a workforce like this if it is unleashed in the right way. So I've now stopped sharing results, and I'm going to move on. And just talk about, in summary of this contextual piece, the real issue here is that many organizations are still thinking like a 20th century company. We have to start thinking like a 21st century company. And that is, what is the culture that we need for the digital era? How do we adopt digital but embrace the human touch? I would argue the human touch is more important than it ever was, particularly now. But how do we use enabling technologies to ensure that we're looking after our people, our customers, we're collaborating, we're communicating in the right way? And this was the background to our research around the blended workforce revolution. We felt that we saw this. We saw this coming, and we didn't understand why this was not formalized on people's agendas when we went to see our key customers, heads of HR and business leaders who were even far more removed from this. So just to give you around some of the where we did, there's a lot on this slide. I do apologize for that, but it's all on one. You can have a look at this. The important thing is here is that the Philippines were part of it. When I show you some of these, I have some numbers in brackets. Where you see numbers in brackets, that is the Philippines number, which I've extracted out of it, but I'll pick up on that. It's a robust survey, and the interesting thing about this survey is that we surveyed both independent workers and so-called digital nomads, and we also interviewed HR and business leaders. So we had perspectives from both. And we also, on top of that, did a few interviews around the world. So you'll see this much greater detail in the white papers that you get. But those interviews were really important to supplement this, to give us some context. The research headlines, again, I'm not going to go into detail, as I mentioned, but you know, you can raise any questions and I'll go into it as you wish. What is absolutely clear is that there is a great need for a new mindset at organizational level and independent worker level, actually, for rules of the road, structures, processes, whereby we can drive forward for mutual advantage. We can look at the same opportunities and challenge for mutual advantage. I'd come back to this point before. 6 out of 10 business and HR leaders said that they expect that 40% of their workforce by 2025 will be made up of independent workers. And what's interesting for me is that I now predict that will be cut in half. Because of what we're going through now, because we will see a recession most likely afterwards as well, we are going to start to see a real shift in how the workforce is made up and managed. The structures and platforms are there to enable independent work and independent workers. The rudimentary structures are there for independent workers and organizations to work together. Plenty of your companies, I'm absolutely sure, are looking at this now thinking, well, in 1-2 years' time, what now does our workforce look like? Because many organizations will be experiencing, particularly those that had started doing remote work anyway, they'll start to see the benefits in productivity terms and wellness terms of well-managed remote work. How well are contributors, be they permanently or independently, can productively work when we remove all the noise from our traditional environments. That will impact workplace and workspace, of course, and therefore it will challenge what we think of as the office and what that means. So WordPress, for example, who do my website and many of yours, I'm sure, that's 100% remote business. IBM, a huge technology business, over half of their workforce is remote. That's 126,000 people, and they've managed to do that really well. When you consider, how this will shift, and the accelerator that is COVID-19 and potentially another, economic kind of inconsistency coming up, things are going to speed up. But the problem is that this trend in terms of the rise of the blended workforce, particularly fueled by independent workers, has been largely an informal process. There's little in the way of how we attract them. When recruiters call many of you, I'm sure they're probably talking about permanent resource, not necessarily independent resource. And this is how it will need to shift. There are two sides to the story, though. It is absolutely clear from our survey that corporates are failing to manage independent workers effectively, and I'll come back to that more. However, it is equally clear that independent workers are not managing the corporate clients that well either, particularly some of the newer, less experienced independent workers that are going into that, offering, let's say, a technology service, but they've never had the career or job experience to create the soft skills, if you like, the skills around communication, collaboration, how to lead discussions, how to structure things. These kind of skill sets are what seem to be the gap in between effective working for both. But then I would then go back to the corporates and saying, well, you can see that's happening, so why aren't you doing something about that? Because largely it's seen as an ad hoc process. And there are two clear things that are happening, which are both enablers and barriers. It is the clash between traditional and digital ways of working. From our feedback, one of the alarming things from human resources or human capital management space is that this is still largely in many traditional companies, so think 20th century thinking, being managed in traditional ways, not necessarily embracing digital ways of working. It's done quite traditionally by people. Whereas a lot of the independent workers are embracing digital ways of working, and then there is a disconnect between the two. So things are happening, but not in a very efficient way. And that is from both ways. So there is an opportunity to almost cross-mentor, on technologies from independence to the corporates, and ways of collaborating better, but also in terms of processes and, if you like, the human skills that they need from corporates to independence. One of the results of not having a formalized process is that that many independent contracts, I would say, are on unsafe terms and conditions. They're being taken advantage of. Now, I fit into this category of being an independent worker, but I have experience in business. I'm a business leader. I'm a learning professional. I look at the people space and the commercial space as well, and I'm able to have these discussions that mean that I won't accept terms that are high risk. I just simply won't do it. For example, we'll do 60 days. We'll do 90 days payment now. That's no good for an independent workforce. However, some are accepting that because they feel it's the right thing to do. And I feel that they're being taken advantage of as well, which is quite interesting in this survey. When we went deeper into that and say, well, look, what will make a really good relationship from the point of view of an independent worker who has experienced the good, the bad, and the ugly of working with corporate spaces? And this is what they came up with. The first is clearer and realistic objectives. So that to me is a really, really worrying piece of feedback. It's a great piece of sort of advice, but the fact is it clearly isn't happening. We don't have the clarity of what we need to do. Can you come in? Can you have a look at our website? These conversations go like this. Can you have a look at our website, see how you could update it for us? Then as it gets into the middle of the project, it's like, well, we didn't really mean that. We want this, and this isn't consistent, that isn't consistent. And suddenly the whole process and project starts to expand because this wasn't set up the front. And then if that isn't set up the front, the support infrastructure isn't there to support it for the second, which is one of the really key things. And I think that if you then flick to number 4, that is where a lot of the complexity comes in. There are many stakeholders that then start to become involved. Nobody is owning at corporate level. The independent workers, some independent workers aren't skilled enough to deal with that or to challenge back. and it starts to be complex. From an independent work point of view, what that means is they're doing more for less in terms of income terms. And for the corporates, they're saying, well, what's going on here? We're paying this amount of money, but we're getting nowhere. What's going on? And it's often a blame game either way. And because there isn't that support infrastructure and necessarily flexibility around working style, that can be accentuated. That flexibility around working style is very directly related to the digital natures of working for many independent workers versus traditional ways of working for some organizations, and very locked in structures. This is the way we work here. We've always done it this way. That's the way we have to work. And I talked about payment terms before. From one of our interviews, I think this is really good kind of to illustrate making the point. One of our independent workers, digital nomad, freelance copywriter, said this, is that, you know, the way putting people in precarious contracts, it happens a lot. They offload risk onto us. We don't have all of these benefits that permanent workers do, so our risk is higher as well, and it's kind of exploitative, and I would have to agree with them. It's largely because we just haven't thought about this as a structured process before. When we do, this hits us very clean in the face, almost like a bullseye, and we're going, wow, what's going on here? We really need to do something. Organizations are failing in terms of management of them. And so related to the payment terms, which are largely ad hoc, when we asked independent workers, well, what do they prefer in terms of working, said that, you know, over 8 out of 10 saying that we need to start moving from ad hoc contracts to longer retainer-based works. That's where we can start to create value, not just add value in an ad hoc way, but start to collaborate longer term and start to learn the culture of the organization and really work together. We can really become a part of that. And there are many independent workers saying that, you know, where they're working well with their company, saying, I'm as passionate as they are about their business. I love working with them. These were some of the other things coming out. Whereas on the flip side, some are saying, I really don't care, you know, I'm being treated like this. I just want to get this job done. And then, you know, on top of that, not only are the independent workers having precarious working practices and structures, but they're not being recognized it. Now, this over 60% aren't being recognized is very deliberately in our survey looked at not just doing good work, but outstanding work. So they're not recognized. Most of them are not recognized, even when they do outstanding work. So if this is going to become a bigger part of our workplace and working ways and ways of working, particularly now, then we have to start thinking about what are the structures put in place. And this is why you'll start to realize why, when I said right at the beginning, we had to come up with a concept here, which we called gig HR. Gig HR is a mentality. It's starting to think this way, because even our permanent workers or part-time permanent workers will start to work this way. Workplace, workspace, all are enablers and barriers in various degrees, depending on where they were. In the next 5 years, according to our research, the key locations will be home, that's quite interesting based on where we are now, remote locations or co-working spaces. In fact, collaborative co-working spaces would be the #1 environment for good productive work, being productive, because we still need that human touch. Right now we're forced to just do that remotely, and I think it's exposing the fact that a lot of us need that human interface. We can talk like this on a computer screen, but sometimes there's no substitution. So when we start to normalize again, much more people will work from home, but a lot will go to co-working spaces as well. But also it's about the digital tools that can enable that. Things like this, Zoom Pro, like we're using here, but also creating not just kind of, I'm using this tool, you using that tool, and we'll try and adapt, but ecosystems that talk to each other. So if I have a long-term retainer with one of my clients and I have similar technologies that can talk to each other, it becomes much smoother to do things. So for example, if I have Microsoft Teams, or if we both collaborate on G Drive, on Google Drive, for example, which I'm doing with various customers. So as an independent worker, I'm becoming much more experienced at different platforms, and I use them for different customers, and that's fine with me. So when you're looking back in the workplace and you're thinking, right, well, what do we need to do? It is about first thinking about a new human capital framework for success. I want to just spend a little bit of time going for this, but I also want to leave time for questions and stick to our original time for this webinar. So I'll go through this relatively quickly. But where this has happened, and it's happened really well, we've learned from. And when Rochelle and I were doing this, we wanted to make this entirely action orientated when we move forward. And this is where we came up with the gig HR framework. And the reason why we did that is that we realized that many corporate and HR leaders still don't know what they don't know about this environment, about the rise of the independent workforce and how this will fundamentally change our workforces in the future. We were predicting by 2025, but I might now say by 2023 even, based on the accelerator of where we are right now. So rapid understanding of this trend is absolutely key, aligned to continuing digitalization of the business, because the two things come together as we talked about. This gig HR is really about thinking about how we structure, manage, measure, and reward this entire workforce. So in fact, you know, it is just our workforce. It's not an independent workforce or permanent workforce. It's our workforce, but our workforce of the future, and how we do that, how we treat people the same. And I think if we take out mental filters around what's permanent and what's not, it actually removes the barriers. Well, for all of our human capital resource, we need the right rules of the road. We need to manage them in the right way, appropriate to their situation and how remote they are, but also we need the recognition and reward as well. So the thing is to start now. So the first step I would suggest is to read our in-depth report, the white paper that you're going to receive at the end of this webinar, because it goes into much more detail. And I've picked up the key pieces of data, but there is a lot more rich data in there to broaden the view of this trend that's going on, particularly from a corporate standpoint, but also in a separate section from the standpoint of an independent worker. The secondly is the need for leadership level of the business at XCOM level to strategically sign off the need for this new framework. Now, this has to be owned by two human capital specialists. First of all, it's about OD, organizational design development, whatever you'd like to call it, because this fundamentally changes how we design and structure our organizations. Then it is for HR to own how that's executed and move forward. So the first key question for you to ask is, what is my likely split of the workforce and where will they work from? Because based on where we are now and the accelerating trend, many organizations are already seeing the cost benefits of remote working, particularly when they can do it productively as well, without problems. So the very best examples out there. This is challenging their thought process now to think about, well, you know what, actually, we could do this going forward. We can actually do this. We're now experiencing and we can actually do it. Flexible rules of the road for permanents, part-timers, remote workers, etc. So that there is an understanding that, you know, the very nature of the gig HR concept is that we need to break down the old locked processes and systems that might have been our 20th century thinking and start to think a more fluid and flexible way of working with the different stakeholders that we've got contributing to our business. And your gig HR framework should then consider how do therefore we move from attraction right up to reward and retention strategies and the whole chain in between, with our own gig HR framework, which is relevant to you. How do we do that so that all of the stakeholders and external partners that we use now, let's say recruitment agencies, benefits agencies, etc., that support our businesses, how do we mobilize them behind the same goal of a much more fluid approach to workforce, a much broader brush in terms of the talent that we're attracting, be it permanent or independent resource, and then how we actually value them and create a culture that is based on values and behaviors that really are appropriate whether you're permanent or an independent worker. You're just a worker. The final thing that I would add to this is that diversity and inclusion will be challenged a little bit further from this. I talked about this. We are seeing that there are existing challenges anyway within this, and we need to accelerate that. So the first element that I would say is, I've just picked out 2 quotes here. This is from a business and a business owner who's saying, look, let's look at independent resources here. We shouldn't treat them differently to we do our permanent resources. We do so at our peril. You know, and actually what this business owner went further in saying is, if I think about it, if I'm honest with myself, we are not inclusive with our independent workers. We're not diverse in terms of how that we do them. And we do have a bias versus permanent versus independent workers. This is a fundamental part of this new strategy that needs to happen, a very solid D&I strategy to go alongside it. This is a really interesting one from a project worker, an independent female, millennial, and around bias and tolerance. I'll let you read that, but you know, very much from the off, I was seen as a subordinate. It was really, I mean, what was really incredible, this person was brought on to think about how they could break down some of the traditional bias and tolerances that issues that they had from a largely male workforce. And the power dynamics that came from that. And therefore it was to help them become less patriarchal. But what she experienced was the very culture that they were trying to break down. It was incredible, as she said it. And from this, I kind of felt that we need a new vocabulary almost. I think diversity needs to shift to, is almost out of date as a term for here now. If we're thinking a blended workforce, it's representation, the diverse representation in our workforce, whether they're independent, whether they're neurodiverse, whether they're permanent, whether they're male, female, cultural, whatever it is. The next one is inclusion. Inclusion is one thing, because mentally I can include somebody. It doesn't mean I have to kind of embrace them into that. I can just point to the fact that I'm including them. If we're driven by the mindset of belonging, that is much more solid for me than inclusion. Representation, belonging, and tolerance beyond bias. Bias, conscious and unconscious bias, I think it's a very difficult concept. We are all human beings, and to a certain extent, we are all biased in any situation, work, life, whatever. I think we should recognize that and be honest about it. But it's our tolerance elements that we can work on. We can actually work on tolerance. We can be supported behind this, and we need to understand that underpinned by the values and behaviors which lead to a culture whereby this can live and breathe. We have developed resources, and together with Power in You, we're bringing them to the Philippines and beyond, ASEAN, in fact. We have sessions, workshop sessions for leaders and keynotes on this. We have a fundamental approach for gig HR, structuring step-by-step how to go through it. And in fact, it's called the Gig House. We build a house, a platform of the cultures. Each room is around part of the Gig HR framework, and the roof then builds on top, and we take your teams step-by-step through that so that they can lead it internally. We can support, as well as the Power in You team, in a very collaborative way. And by the way, we can do it all remotely as well as face-to-face as we're doing this. But I would say start with that white paper, and that will take you there and to the website and web resources that we have, as you can see here. So I would like to say a very thank you. I apologize, I had to speed up a little bit there towards the end. However, I'm very willing to take any questions. I've not been able to look at the chats as we've been going through, Elaine. So perhaps I can hand back to you and we can go into some Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. Thank you so much. As I'm sharing my screen, let me just read a couple of questions that have come up. From Shireen, many used to scoff at professionals' credibility for embracing the gig economy. How can professionals establish reputation?
Shireen, my old friend from Malaysia. Hello, how are you? Really nice to see you and to get the question from you. And what a great question. And this is where I say that, you know, we're in an acceleration of this trend right now. It is the same attitude, Shireen, that has put roadblocks in place in some diversity inclusion discussions that have been that needed to have happened. I mean, particularly in Southeast Asia, I know we've talked about this before, but also in digitalization and that digital transformation and how the business moves forward. And up to 10 weeks ago, even some companies saying, working remotely, it will never happen. It's not what we want. It is about mindset first, and that is leadership mindset first. And the sad fact is, Shireen, within this is that there's many leaders are A, not ready, and B, too blinkered in 20th century thinking in some ways in order to look out and embrace this. The very best organizations that do it, can't be wrong, surely. The Googles, the IBMs, the WordPresses, DBS Bank, for example, in across the Southeast Asian region. All of these are embracing this ways of working and embracing the concept of workforce, not just meaning permanence, but just workforce, wherever they're from, in all lenses. So it starts at the very top. Then it actually drives an embedding culture, and that often needs a mindset change at organizational level, but a culture shift which is relevant for now. So I would say, actually, organizations starting at this, working on the new values and behaviors which should be modeled at leadership level first and embraced through the rest of the organization, that are appropriate for the era that we're in, the digital era, the rise of the blended workforce, the need for more, if you like, representation and tolerance levels there is what is going to be the platform for success. But for me, in some organizations, that has to start at the top, and that pressure for change is what is happening now. It's not just about what we're shifting into remote work. It's about rethinking how we work full stop and what our workforce of the future looks like, because it's a question of survival. It has to happen, and it starts at the top.
That's the next normal. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jeremy. There was a question given to us also on how do you think COVID-19 the enforced home or remote working, which in the Philippines is called the ECQ, in Singapore it's called the CB, the circuit breaker, other would just call it lockdown, will impact the trend or the impact the trend or the rise of the blended workforce.
Yep.
Jeremy?
Well, I also, and Elaine and I were both on a similar session with the American Chamber of the Philippines on Friday, weren't we, Elaine? And this came up a lot. This, for me, I was championing the thought that this is a huge accelerator of many of these transformations that we're seeing. So I believe strongly that it is a driver of digital transformation, but more importantly, these trends which we did. So remember, this research that I'm presenting here, we only launched it at the end of January, I think, or even early February by the time that we launched it. And we were predicting this would happen. When COVID-19 hit and we saw what was going on and we read deeper into this, there is clear evidence that this is already an accelerating kind of catalyst for change. So it's about change in how we work and embracing remote work. But also it's a way for many organizations, and some great examples in Europe and across Asia Pacific, for how the workforce mix has changed. Because in some countries, we call it furloughing in the UK, is that the government is paying a percentage of salary for permanent resource so that it's not a cost burden on the organizations going through this, but they're not allowed to work for the company if they're getting paid that, because it's government cost. So where the resource is needed, there is a kind of a new appreciation of what the independent workforce can provide and give. And it does relate to another question that I've seen there, because it's also about recognizing that the remote sort of independent workforce is a talent pool which has been relatively untapped. Mm-hmm. And the next war for talent may not be for permanent resource. I predict it will be for independent resource. Because as we move to longer term contracts, different ways of working, and it will accelerate, as I've said throughout this presentation, by approximately so we thought the acceleration would be by 2025. With COVID-19, we have revised down to mid 2022. Okay. So 2.5 years in terms of the acceleration based on COVID-19.
Mhm. So thanks, Jeremy, for answering that. And in fact, we do have a couple of questions from Shireen again. Would organizations still be equally responsible for talent development and training of independent workers? I think you answered that partly. Do you have anything else to add to that, Jeremy?
Well, yes, I answered part of that, but it is again it's a new mentality for OD and HR. It is a new mentality to consider workforce as a much broader palette, and it is it's why would we not have a structure to upskill and support our most valued independent workers, because we see how that benefits our permanent workers. It's just that we're seeing it through a very fuzzy lens at the moment. So that is absolutely a part of the foundation of how you build this blended workforce moving forward, and that absolutely must be in place. However, there is a responsibility on the independent worker side as well to upskill, and this was a challenge that we laid at their door within the white paper, is that they had a responsibility and should have taken more responsibility for upskilling, for how they best practice collaborate, communicate, structure projects, for example, so that they could almost reverse coach the client as well as the other way around. So there is responsibility on both sides, but there is a big need at corporate level because it simply doesn't exist in many organizations.
Mm-hmm. And that the empowerment is happening anyway in most workplaces, but also we'll see more of that. Employees, whether, the independent worker, as we call them, will be or not, will have to be empowered. And part of that, of course, is the talent development. Hopefully, we still have questions that will come in. Cheaper costs for organizations, since they seem not responsible for such benefits. How would that change the game of employer branding?
Yeah,
Any comment on that, Jeremy?
Yeah, this is the war for talent 4.0 for me. That is about, we have been focused on employer branding as regards our permanent resources go. However, there is an influx now. The interesting thing about the gig economy is that the majority is millennial led, but the last 2 years, the biggest population moving into independent work has been Generation X. That's my generation and your generation, anyway. Those of us that have had a lot of experience, we've looked into our companies, and I did it in my old company, and I said, this is not going in the right direction for me. I think we should be speeding up in this area, and you know what? I can do this better myself. And we bring a lot of experience to bear, but we are still, learning how to be independent workers. If you consider the available talent that is out there, then driving an employer brand to independent workers to attract the very best independent workers, if you can be ahead of the game on that, you're ahead of your competition in the next 2.5 years, and you have competitive advantage because you've got the very best permanents, but you've also got the very best independent workers. Link that together with a great retention strategy, better recognition, maybe even benefits that come in for independent workers as well based on performance, then you're right, it's a more costly way of doing it, but you're building something which is beyond brand. It's something that people want to belong to.
Mm-hmm. And that's all the time we have for Q&A. Thank you so much, Jeremy, for your time and for always being available to share with the audience that we have in Power in You. And we hope to see more of you in future webinars.
Thank you, Elaine. You can count on it, as you know.
Thank you.